We're good to go. Brilliant. We're online. Wonderful. Well, look, good afternoon and welcome to everyone joining us both here in Paris, but also online. I know there's many of you watching us today. This event is being recorded and it will be published online. So you'll be able to listen back to today's discussions whenever you like. But of course, we're here because it's Equal Pay Day on September the 18th. And nearly every year for the past few years, we at the OECD have been delighted to mark the occasion by co-hosting an event with Iceland, a great champion for gender equality within and beyond the OECD. Of course, we celebrate Equal Pay Day this year, just after the Olympics and Paralympics. And those of us who live in Paris still have this warm glow from all the incredible events that we've seen. And of course, Paris was the Olympics over 100 years ago, where women competed for the first time. Well, okay, it was only 22 women, but it was at least the start. And this year, for the first time, there's been equal numbers of men and women competing at the Olympics. So progress. But of course, sports continues to be plagued by inequalities in participation, pay, and conditions. And some women take second jobs just to be able to afford their professional careers. We're very lucky today to be joined by world-class athletes and experts to help us unpack what's driving these inequalities and what can be done to address them. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to the welcoming remarks from Mr. Mathias Corman, the Secretary General of the OECD. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and dear Ambassador Orradóttir-Ramette, dear Unnur, dear ambassadors, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all. A very warm welcome to this event on closing the pay gap toward pay equity in sports, which we are hosting with Iceland. Iceland, a global leader on this issue ahead of International Equal Pay Day next week. International Equal Pay Day is, of course, about recognizing our progress in closing the gender pay gap, but also reflecting on what else needs to be done, the remaining gap that needs to be closed, and renewing our commitment to go further. Inspired by this year's Olympic and Paralympic Games here in Paris, as Mark also just noted, our discussion to mark this day will focus on pay equity in sports. Pay equity in sports is not just about fairness, it's also about ensuring sports can attract and retain the best talent to be competitive and inclusive. The Games here in Paris showed that progress has been made towards gender equality both on and off the field. The Paris Olympics were the first to allocate an equal number of quota places to male and female athletes. This historic achievement was particularly fitting because Paris was also the host of the first Olympics with women competitors back in 1900, when 22 women competed out of a total of 997 athletes. So there was a very big gap then, but it was a start, and we achieved equality of participation, at least at the Paris Olympics in 2024. In parallel, we have seen progress in individual sports towards pay equity. For example, all 4 of the Grand Slam tournaments in tennis have supported equal pay for women and men since 2007 with equal prize money. Football, or soccer as some call it, has also made progress. Back in 2019, my home country of Australia was one of the first to guarantee equal pay and working conditions for women and men national teams. And the 2026 FIFA World Cup, to be held in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, has also made commitments relating to equal pay for equal work for women. However, full pay equity is not yet a reality in sport. And it's not yet a reality, full stop. Full-time working women across OECD countries earn on average around 88 cents to every dollar or euro made by a full-time working man. And pay gaps remain in sports too. In the 2024 Forbes rankings of the world's highest paid athletes, there's not a single woman in the top 50 people. Even as many women's sports are popular and some, such as soccer in the United States, even outpace men's soccer when it comes to revenues. Closing pay gaps will require us to address the drivers of broader gender inequalities. In sports, this includes setting parity targets, fighting discrimination, and enlisting the private sector to recognize the value of sponsoring women athletes. It also means addressing barriers such as lack of resources and sports facilities dedicated to women and girls to ensure their participation in sports and physical activity throughout their lives and beyond the elite sporting events we all watch. And of course, it requires tackling the inequitable distribution of unpaid care and housework, which take time away from women athletes to train. The OECD is committed to help and is committed to promoting pay equity, both in sports and of course, more broadly, through our work on gender equality and our implementation of our OECD's gender strategy. First, we continue to develop best practice policy advice on closing the gender pay gap. For example, we have created the most comprehensive global policy database on pay gap reporting measures. And leveraging this database, we have developed guidance to countries on strengthening pay transparency policies, such as investing in digital tools to streamline and simplify employers' reporting of their pay data. We are also providing targeted advice to countries such as Italy to help inform their reforms to close the gender pay gap, including as part of implementing the 2023 EU Pay Transparency Directive. Second, we provide gender equality standards and best practices that are tailored to specific sectors, including on closing pay gaps. For example, the OECD recommendation on global events and local development helps countries and event hosts to consider how such events can support gender equality from the design and planning phase. The related OECD global events impact indicators use gender disaggregated data to help set and measure gender equality targets, including on pay ratios for participants and organizers across men and women. Paris 2024 was the first ever global event to develop its impact strategy using the OECD guidance. And from now on, the International Olympic Committee will require future Games hosts to do the same. Third, we're helping to make gender data more visible and accessible to support countries to track their progress towards closing the gender pay gap, and indeed to identify the remaining gap to be closed. The OECD dashboard on gender gaps provides a one-stop shop on gender quality performance indicators, including the gender wage gap. We have also launched the Gender Data Initiative to promote good practices in the organization and in our member countries to develop gender data. This will help us better measure gender pay gaps and track progress towards equal pay. Fourth, we provide a global platform to convene experts and policymakers from OECD member and non-member countries to exchange best practices and to prompt policy action to promote equal pay. We hosted our inaugural Forum on Gender Equality here at the OECD, here in Paris, back in June. And we will be publishing a policy paper based on those discussions, which identifies policy priorities for tackling the gender pay gap to support equitable and inclusive global transitions. Our efforts show that change is happening, but that we must do more and we must do more faster. We're very fortunate to have with us today several world-class athletes and experts who have effectively advocated for pay equity in sports and who understand the barriers to equal pay and who have good suggestions on how we can get there when it comes to closing the remaining gaps. The insights you will be sharing with us here today will be invaluable to help us identify opportunities, to help us lift our ambitions, to close the gender pay gap in sports, to the benefit of both athletes and fans, and indeed to close the gender pay gap more broadly. So very much looking forward to some positive, productive and outcomes-focused discussions. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words at the outset. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Secretary General. We do our best to put gender at the heart of all our analysis. We don't always succeed, but you always do push us to keep doing better. I think we now have a message from Prime Minister Benediktsson. Yeah, are we ready for this? Good, please go ahead.
Secretary General, Mr. Corman, Ambassador Orradóttir-Ramette, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It is with immense pleasure to welcome you to the 5th International Equal Pay Day event. And thank you, Mr. Corman, for your kind words on the leadership of Iceland in drawing attention to equal pay from 2019. It has been an honor co-hosting the event with the OECD. This year, the event is dedicated to the pursuit of pay equity, particularly in sports. Of course, it is specifically significant as it coincides with an Olympic and Paralympic year, highlighting the global stage where athletes showcase their talents and inspire millions. I myself did have the opportunity to visit Paris for the Olympic opening session, but unfortunately, I could not be with you today. Dear guests, in general, closing the pay gap is a fundamental issue of fairness and equality. In recent decades, we have witnessed significant strides in advancing gender equality in sports. Women's sports have seen extraordinary growth in participation, viewership, and revenue. This year, for the first time, the Olympic Games are expected to achieve gender parity, with female athletes representing 50% of the competitors. This is a remarkable improvement from the 38% in 2000. Additionally, women's sports are getting more and more popular, and global revenues for women's elite sports are growing rapidly. For instance, the FIFA Women's World Cup final in 2023 set record viewership in many countries. Despite these achievements, significant gender pay inequalities persist. These disparities reflect broader inequalities in opportunities, media coverage, investment, ticket sales, and viewership. Issues to be addressed in today's discussions. As Mr. Corman noted, to close pay gaps, we need to address the drivers of broader gender gaps, and the good work of the OECD on gender equality are a helpful guiding light. Dear guests, your task today is a vital one, and I hope you will enjoy a meaningful discussion on pay equality in sports. May your day be a successful one. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Prime Minister Benediktsson. Okay, so we've done the opening ceremony type bits of this event, and now we're going to get into the heart of it. And to kickstart today's discussions, we are very privileged to have with us Miss Joanna Lohman, a world-class footballer. Can I call you a footballer? Do I have to call you a soccer player? No, I can. Right, thank you. She's not only represented her country on the US national team, but she's been a very vocal proponent of equal pay, equality, and inclusivity on and off the field. Now, before we invite her up on stage, and indeed invite the person who will invite her up on stage, We do have a bit of a problem here, I think, because we're very polite at the OECD. You know, when we have a nice economist or a minister come in on stage, this is what we do when they've made their speech or when they come on stage. We go like that, right? It's all very demure, very mindful for the TikTokers amongst you, and it doesn't work when we've got professional sports people, okay? So we need, when they come on stage, to really make some noise, okay? Now I'm relying on you. Shall we practice? We'll have a practice. Okay, so just imagine that Joanna's coming on stage. Let's hear the attempt at some noise. Come on. Hey! Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was for me. I know it was for me, really. Okay. Well, I think we're ready then. We need to keep that going for everybody when they come on stage. And the first person to officially introduce, I'm introducing the person we'll introduce. That's what we're doing. I'm introducing somebody who is actually very important, Mr. Daniel Mickelson, Head of Sports Diplomacy at the US Department of State. So, Mr. Mickelson, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Secretary General Corman, Prime Minister Benediktsson, and good afternoon, Excellencies and colleagues. As I was introduced, my name is Dan Mickelson. I'm from the US Department of State, where I am the Sports Diplomacy Chief, and I'm also the US Government's Coordinator for International Athletics. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today to introduce this really important speaker to you, Joanna Lohman. Joanna is a retired footballer, I think I got that right, who has a celebrated 16-year career between her time with the women's national soccer team and numerous other professional teams. Beyond the pitch, she carries many titles, including author, performance coach, global speaker, and mom. My team back in Washington has had the honor of supporting her on 9 overseas trips where she's represented the United States as a sports envoy and a Goodwill Sports Ambassador. She's one of our most decorated sports envoys, having completed a total of 9 trips since 2015, inspiring youth around the world. And as recently this year was in Cambodia. Thank you. So I hope she's not done. Fingers crossed that you'll go out for us again. Joanna's personal experiences and rich background in leadership and social impact make her the perfect person to be here today as we celebrate Equal Pay Day. So as we approach Equal Pay Day, we should celebrate how far we've come, but it's even more important to notice how far we have to go to close that gender pay gap. Being from the United States, I want to highlight and celebrate the Equal Pay for Team USA Act that was signed by President Biden in 2023. We hope it inspires other nations to follow in our footsteps, much like we've followed in the Australians' footsteps. The act requires equal pay for all athletes competing in global competitions around the world, and it does not matter what your gender is. So despite this progress, we recognize we still have a lot of work to do in the United States. Women workers on average are paid only 84 cents for every dollar that are paid to men. Inequities that cost American women a whole of $1 trillion a year. So it's great to be here today to reaffirm our commitment to closing the gender pay gap and ensuring that all people have a fair and equal opportunity to participate in the labor force and support their families. So let's get that big applause going. Get out of your seats. Let's welcome Joanna Lohman up to the stage.
Thank you. Today, I want to take you on a journey, an experience that brings us back in time so we can collectively move forward. That journey starts on July 10th, 1999, the day the United States women's national team faced off against China in the Women's World Cup final. I take you inside the storied Rose Bowl Stadium, where the thermometer reads 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, the heat equal to the pressure the US women faced the entire tournament. The game is a sellout, 90,000 spectators decked out in red, white, and blue, 40 million more tuning in from home. It would make it, at that time, the most watched soccer game, setting an international record for spectators in a women's sporting event. Now, after 90 minutes of sweaty, suspenseful soccer, the US and China are locked in a decisive penalty kick shootout. Only the most dramatic way to end a soccer game. I'm going to take you inside of that drama. The US and China both made their first 2 kicks. There are 5 kickers. We are on to our 3rd kicker for China. That is when my future teammate and friend, Brianna Scurry, the fearless goalkeeper for the US, steps into the net. As the Chinese player approaches to strike the ball, Bri comes off her line. She shifts to the left, and she launches into the air to deflect the ball outside of the post. The crowd erupts. Bri pumps her fists, lets out a scream, "Let's go! Let's go!" She knows she has given the US the edge. We are now on to our 3rd kicker for the US. Christine Lilly, cool as ice, unfazed by the pressure, she slots the ball into the back of the net. The Chinese player does the same. The next kicker for the US, none other than Mia Hamm, the greatest goal scorer on the planet, and the face of this team and a reluctant star. In very Mia fashion, she doesn't want to take a PK. And it wasn't until her assistant coach goes up to her and says, "Mia, you are the greatest goal scorer on the planet. You have to take a PK," that Mia began to believe that this was her moment. She runs up to the ball, strikes it, back of the net, goal US. The next Chinese player does the same. That means we are tied 4-4 in penalty kicks. And the US has their 5th and final shooter to win it all. Who would that shooter be? Brandi Chastain, the chosen one. Now keep in mind, Brandi Chastain had missed a PK against the same team, same goalkeeper only months before. But her coach believed in her with 1 catch. He asked Brandi to strike it with her left foot, her weaker foot, rather than her dominant right foot, to keep the Chinese goalie off balance. Brandi had never taken a PK in a game with her left foot until that moment. Brandi places the ball down. A hush falls over the crowd. She backs up 5 yards, fixes her ponytail, takes a deep breath, and coolly strides up to the ball, smashes it with that left foot. The ball rockets into the upper right corner. The crowd goes wild. Her teammates rush towards her. Brandi immediately rips off her shirt, drops to her knees, and flexes those beautiful muscles and 6-pack abs. And right there, in that sweat-dripping, muscle-flexing moment, the United States women's national team emphatically showed us what was possible. They gave us all permission to see the world and women differently. The tournament would go on to break records in terms of merchandise sales and television audiences. It was deemed a huge financial success. The players became overnight celebrities on late-night talk shows and news programs. But what many don't know is that originally FIFA, the world governing body of soccer, wanted to limit the tournament to smaller stadiums, afraid that the players would perform in empty arenas, unable to sell tickets. Julie Foudy, the captain of the team on the field and the leading voice for decades for pay disputes, said upon reflection, "Do you know how close we were to having this done safely? We could have easily said, don't take a risk. But instead, they took huge risks under immense pressure, playing in big stadiums, generating buzz, and practically selling tickets out of their back pockets. Because of these risks, and in spite of FIFA, the 1999 Women's World Cup final was a watershed moment for women's sports because of the cultural impact and the public interest generated. We are only talking about equal pay today because of the 99ers. The 99ers birthed a DNA strand that consistently demanded progress. They ushered in a generation of young girls who dared to dream. And I was one of those girls. In 1999, at 17 years old, I was one of the lucky youth soccer players invited to the White House to watch as President Bill Clinton honored the US women and their world championship. With my own eyes, I got to see Julie Foudy, Brittany Chastain, Mia Hamm, Brianna Scurry walk off that team bus and lift that trophy in front of their adoring fans. The image is burned into my brain because it was the first time in my life where I knew without a doubt in my mind that I could write my own story. I could write my own story. And that story included 16 years of being a professional soccer player. I became the first player in Washington Spirit history to have her jersey retired. And I became a member of the United States women's national team. I guess you could say my dreams came true. But that dream only paid $15,000 a year. It consisted of 2 failed professional leagues in the United States of America, a nomadic existence where I hopped around the world playing for 7 different teams in 5 different countries, constantly scrapping to compete with subpar resources and training facilities. That dream required me to house with host families, find side jobs to pay my bills. It was embarrassing. And honestly, in my career, equal pay wasn't even in my vocabulary. I just wanted to get paid. Something, anything, please. And while I was the exception in terms of my talent, I was the 1% of the 1%. I was like any other woman, severely underpaid in comparison to her male counterparts for doing the exact same job. The exact same job. What kind of message does that send? The more important question, how can a female athlete reach her full potential when she is deemed unessential? How can a female athlete reach her full potential when she is deemed unessential? And while I can look back and always wonder what if, I know I can look forward with certainty because our struggles build strength. Our challenges created change, big change, an explosion of women's sports. And it was in this great nation of France in 2019 that the United States women's national team won their 4th World Cup while suing their employer, US Soccer, for equal pay. After decades of underfunded championship runs, the women were making more revenue than the men and still getting paid less. More revenue than the men and still getting paid less. It was time to make a statement. So as Megan Rapinoe smashed in free kicks and celebrated with her arms wide, patented leap, they captivated our globe and demanded that we not look away. And as the confetti fell on that historic team, I can still hear the chants of equal pay ringing through that stadium in Lyon. Equal pay, equal pay, equal pay. It was an iconic moment that transcended sport and led to the passage of the Equal Pay Act, Equal Pay Team USA Act of 2023. And now in 2024, with gaining momentum and traction, we're in an unprecedented moment. Global revenues for women's elite sports will exceed $1 billion in 2024, a 300% increase since 2021. We had the first Olympics that we know that achieved complete gender parity. We have the highest valued women's sporting team on the planet at $250 million, Angel City FC. The 2024 NCAA women's basketball final made history by having more viewership than the men. And research shows that female athletes are the best and most effective brand influencers. I could go on. Records are cascading down like Caitlin Clark 3-pointers. And history, or shall I say herstory, is being made on a daily basis. It is loud and clear. These athletes are more than just performers. They are marketing mavens, influencing culture and buying trends. They are rewriting the script on what it means to be a female athlete and inviting investors and fans along for the ride. To quote the famous Megan Rapinoe, when she said, "We aren't having a moment. We are the moment." We are the moment. And yet in 2024, with growing popularity and participation in women's sports, one glaring discrepancy still remains: the pay gap. Reports show that women athletes are still making significantly less than their male counterparts across almost all sports. This extends when they're playing in front of large audiences at the highest level and secure major sponsorships. That means the pay gap extends to prize money, sponsorships, endorsements, and media coverage. Currently, only 15% of media coverage is dedicated to the women. Visibility matters. Visibility matters. When women get less media coverage, it impacts their marketability, leading to less lucrative endorsement deals. The lack of investment in women's funding in women's team sports perpetuates the cycle of inequality. Let's think about it. When a women's team is given less funding, they have less access to training facilities, less opportunities to compete at the highest level. This not only affects their lifelong wealth, but how they show up on and off the field, sadly keeping the pay gap alive. How does a female athlete reach her full potential if she is deemed unessential? Closing that pay gap and making her essential, yes, it's about dollar signs, but it's more than that. It's about respect, recognition, and equality. It's about breaking down the barriers that have kept women from reaching their potential in sports. We are at a pivotal moment in history right now, where the conversation around pay equity is gaining momentum. But we need more than talk, we need action. So as fans, sponsors, endorsers, governing bodies, we all have a role to play to ensure the future of athletes don't have to fight the same battles. The legendary Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, "Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time." One step at a time. And I will add in one person at a time, which leads to the next step in my journey. After retiring from professional soccer in 2019 and establishing myself as a leading voice for pay equity, social justice, and sports diplomacy, my wife and I decided to have a child in 2022. And when we learned that child would be a girl, our hearts exploded. Strength comes in numbers. She could be a torchbearer for equality, a beacon of light for humanity. And I'll never forget that day, January 4th, 2023, the day that our daughter Luna came into this world, and the day that my wife and I became moms, or as Luna calls me, her JoJo. And when I held her for that very first time and I stared into her beautiful blue eyes, I could see the blazed trails leading her forward. I could see hope. Because the reality is, if Luna chooses to play sports, she will have more opportunities than I could ever dream of. She can make more money than I did in my entire career. And she could be an active benefactor in the tidal wave of women's sports that was once a quiet pond. How cool is that? And to think, her JoJo fought, even in the slightest of ways, to create this new reality. Like so many women before me, I was never paid a living wage. But I waged the fight for equality and access. There were countless women who played their hearts out for future generations. There are countless women who are doing it now. So many of you in this room, you have changed our world. For Luna and every young boy and girl out there who dreams of a better tomorrow than we have today, let's keep changing it. Let's continue to work together to ensure that in the future, when we talk about athletes who inspire us, we talk about them not as male or female, but simply athletes. Respected, celebrated, and equally compensated for what they contribute to the sports that we love. And it is only then, when we deem a female athlete equally essential, that we as a society can reach our full potential. Thank you.
Wow. Well, you talked of inspiration. I mean, I'm certainly inspired. I'm also horrified. 15,000, really? That's unbelievable. That was a really fantastic opening to our discussions this afternoon. Our next speaker has also played a huge, I should say, Joanna, you will join us for the panel after the break, won't you? Yeah, great. So there'll be a chance to ask questions to Joanna. So, you know, start thinking online as well. There'll be a chance to ask questions. Our next speaker has also played a big role in inspiring women and girls into sports, and she's going to join us for what's called a fireside chat. Of course, there's no fire, but anyway. So we have a fireside chat followed by a questions and answers session with all of you. And we are, I'm looking at the back to check all is okay. All is okay. We're very privileged to have with us online the 5 times Olympic champion and 7 times world champion, former cyclist from the United Kingdom, Dame Laura Kenny. Dame Laura, you there? Ah,
yes.
Fantastic. You know, thank you so much for joining us. Wow, I'm having a bit of a fanboy moment. It's so strange to be speaking to you, but thank you so much for coming. You're the most successful female British Olympian of all time, which is incredible. And you've inspired, well, so many women and girls into sport, so many men as well. But let's start by asking you, how much has changed for women in cycling since you started, and where do you see the biggest gaps remaining?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, it's hugely different. Like the racing scene now, it's something that it's not recognizable compared to what it was when I first started. I actually remember my first memory of thinking, wow, this doesn't seem like a professional sport, was going over to, my coach basically said to me, you need to start doing some road cycling, some road racing. It will help you track, it will help you on the velodrome. And my sister was already over living in Belgium. And so that was really the only racing that you could get for female athletes was over in Europe. You had to travel, you had to go over to Belgium. Great Britain really didn't have any races that were worth entering because we just didn't have the numbers. So I said to my sister, oh, can I come and live with you? Like, can I come and move in with you for a bit? You know, they're saying that this will really help my career. And so she's like, yeah, cool, come. The only team that I could actually get a ride on was it was a Belgium team. They obviously didn't speak a word of English. I didn't get paid to do it. I just had to fund everything myself. And then my sister, who was on a professional team, was getting paid $5,000 a year. And it was just, I just remember the struggles for her. She was relying on my dad. Like, she was so lucky that my dad could actually help fund it and help fund her career, because ultimately that was what bike riders were getting paid at the time. Whereas actually now, it's grown massively. There are so many more professional teams. There is now a minimum wage. There are races that, you know, we could only have dreamt of at the time. There's finally a Tour de France. Now, I'm not saying it's where we want it to be, but we've got one. And that to me is a starting point. So the difference between when I first started to now is huge. Like, they have come such a long way, which obviously I am so grateful for. I know so many people who have got younger girls who, you know, are trying to get their daughters into sport. So I'm so grateful that it has had the growth that it's had. But do I think that it's still got a long way to go? 100%. Why is our Tour de France so much shorter than the men's? Why is the Giro not covered on as many days on the TV as the men's? And there's so many questions and so many things that I think, you know, can be done and should be done. For example, I think the men's team should be forced to have a women's team alongside it. I think, you know, if you say you can't be in a UCI team if you haven't got a female team run alongside it, you need to run a women's team, right? It is something like 2% of the cost that the men's is to run. It's such a small number. Why are all the teams not just forced down that road of, you know, it has to be equal, you have to have a women's team? So I do think, you know, there are massive gaps still that need to be filled, but I'm not going to take away from the fact that I do think it's grown massively.
I mean, how is it now, the pay equity comparing women cyclists and male cyclists? How big is the gap? I mean,
this year, I mean, the gap's still huge. I think the men's highest paid rider's 5 million, and the women this year is the first £1 million contract should be signed at the end of this year. So obviously the gap is still massive, and we're talking about, like, I don't know the exact difference between the minimum wage, but the minimum wage for the women is also much lower. I mean, it's insane that was 3 years ago that was only put in place. Like, that's mental in my eyes. And I know that the difference on average for the women is way lower. They're getting still paid less than half of what the men are. But the biggest issue for me is the coverage. Like, we need more coverage, and it has got better. It really has. Like, Discovery do put on most of the women's bike races now. But if we don't have the coverage and we're not seen and we're not getting the viewings, obviously the sponsors aren't coming on board. So then we're not getting the money for the bike riders. And we live in this horrible thing where I just feel like we go around in this big circle, and it's like, well, yeah, because they're not doing this and they're not doing that. And if everyone just bought into the idea of women's sport is insane, it is fantastic to watch. It's no different. It cracks me when we say, oh, we're going to watch the Women's World Cup. No, we're going to watch the World Cup. Like, yes, okay, the women are competing, but it's still the World Cup. And for ages, the tour was like, the tour can't be known as the tour. It has to be known as La Femme Tour. And for me, I'm like, well, what is still the tour? Like, it shouldn't even have a different name, whether it's the females or the males riding. So yeah, I do feel like there are a lot of gaps still that, you know, we need to just get it together.
I mean, it's incredible, and I think embarrassing that you have a different minimum wage for the same sport between men and women. I mean, I don't know whether that happens anywhere else in the economy, in employment, but I mean, I find that absolutely staggering. But it's not just pay, is it? I mean, you've already touched on sponsorship and advertising deals. So in your experience, this also differs presumably hugely between men and women.
Yeah, so from my actual personal experience, obviously me and my husband, so Jason is also Britain's most successful male Olympian, well, all-time Olympian. So to compare the two of us, actually, I think we are the opposite to what you see elsewhere. So for me, I've always had lots of sponsors. I've always worked with lots of brands, whereas my husband actually doesn't get that. But just to add to that, obviously, I would say it's not always whether it's male or female. Jason and I are very different personalities, which I totally appreciate. So if you are more, you know, like a sponsor's cup of tea, then that's fair enough. But across the board, there's a huge difference in sponsorship funding, and even I would actually say like options for women. Like, lots of the brands will just go straight for a male, someone who has been in the spotlight a lot longer. And I think that actually does come from what I said before. We don't get the coverage. So sponsors aren't seeing it. Like, if women's sport was on TV every single day, like the Premier League is, for example, you'd have a lot more ambassadors for the brands. But because it's not, brands aren't choosing the females. And so there is a big difference. I mean, again, I do think it has shifted. I know lots of the female tennis players actually have a lot of sponsors. Whether they get paid the same, I don't know. But I know, yeah, so I think the mentality has shifted, but I do still think it is quite heavily male dominant.
I mean, we coming onto that coverage point, I mean, I watched you doing the Olympics coverage over the past few weeks. I mean, I know you don't necessarily have a great insight into the decisions made about what to cover, but did you get some impression that in coverage of the Olympics there was some preference for showing the male events or female events, or is that at least something that's changing?
I would actually say that the Olympics is the one time that I always feel that it is equal, because this was the first time that we actually had equal events and equal amount of females versus males. And so I actually feel like when you're watching any sport, the Olympics is the only time that we get totally equal coverage, everything, to be honest, interview time. And that for me, I mean, obviously being an Olympic sport, like that's brilliant for me, like I just think that is something that should be celebrated, like the fact that that was totally equal and the coverage was totally equal.
Coming on to, I suppose it's a little bit more personal, if you don't mind. I mean, motherhood clearly affects athletes' opportunities, and you've been very open, I think, about your experience of returning to cycling after having children. I mean, you went on to win the gold at the Tokyo Olympics after having after the birth of your first child. But how was it? I mean, what was your experience in having a child, being a mother, and coming back to elite sport?
Well, the first thing I would say is actually, as a female, having to tell people that you are pregnant and that you're going to pause your career was absolutely terrifying. Honestly, I thought, this is it. They're going to kick me off. Like, there is just no way that they are going to be prepared to support this, because it's not even the period of time that you're pregnant when you're out of racing. I've got to get back to the fitness and the form that I had. And I just thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm even going to word this to my coach, because they're going to kick me out the door. Actually, I would say I had a very positive experience. British Cycling had no clue, basically. And so we were both starting from scratch. And actually, I think that was the best place to be, because they didn't know what was going to work. And so they didn't know, they couldn't really give me any advice, but it also meant they couldn't really stop anything either. So I would go to them with ideas that I felt like, could make me a better bike rider, and I could then balance my family life and my athlete career. And then they would either say yes or no, or they would come back with a slightly altered reasoning for it. And for me, I felt like we actually really did work as a team. I feel like my outcome and I can only speak positively of my journey. However, what I would say is, since I did it, I have had other people come to me from all different sports, and not everybody's journey is the same. There has been lots of kickback from some people, feeling like they've been kicked out of a team, feeling like they're not welcome back onto a team, feeling like the selection criteria is made more difficult for them, whether that be bringing in timelines, so like moving it closer to the birth of their child, so they would only say get 3 months to make it back onto the squad rather than 6, or whether it making them feel isolated, making them feel like they can't bring their child on training camp, so then they wouldn't go on the training camps, and then ultimately you're isolating an athlete. So my experience within British Cycling was brilliant, and I truly believe people should look at what they did, because I'm now not the only one who sat here with a gold medal being a mum. There's been a number of British cycling athletes who have now gone on to win gold medals at the latest Olympics. And seriously, I think they should go to British Cycling and they should ask exactly what they did to make those athletes successful, because I've heard a lot of horror stories from other people, and not even just mums. There has been some kickback around dads bringing their little ones, like with their partners, obviously, to training camps. Now, what I would say is, right, being an athlete and being a sports person, that environment is intense. And I don't believe that every single training session, every single training camp, you should have children there. You've also got to understand that lots of mums come back into team sports. Now, there might be, speaking again from experience, there might be people who are on those teams who have had heartbreak when it comes to having children. So bringing a child into that environment will actually make other people perform worse. So there are some occasions that I think, life should be kept separately. But if you are asking someone, a dad, to go on a 4-week, 5-week training camp, I believe that there should be an option for families to come. And so as a woman, yes, obviously it has been difficult, but I do think I should mention it was also tough for a couple of male athletes that I know.
Okay, I mean, that's great that there's a positive example. I mean, it is great to hear things that go well for once, rather than always hearing the horror stories. So I would really like to know more about some of the things British Cycling did, but maybe another time. You announced your retirement earlier this year. Is there a gendered difference in life after sport? Do you feel that your experience is different than retired male athletes?
So for me, obviously, I always felt like, I don't know whether you can tell, I quite like talking. And so I always sort of thought I'd like to work in the media. And so for me, I've just gone sort of down that road. You know, I started to work with the BBC for the Olympic coverage, and that's something that I'd now like to kind of keep going and carry on. My husband is a coach. He went for the position of the Olympic coach, and he got the Olympic coaching. So he's taken his team to the Olympics this year. Now, I would say across the board, if I wanted to be a coach, it wouldn't necessarily be as easy for me because there's way less opportunities. I don't actually know of a female, I'm just going to talk from British cycling side. I don't know of a female who has ever coached a male team. And so, but I do know of men who have coached female teams. So if you say there's 10 jobs, there's 10 coaching jobs available, I can only go for 5 of them, whereas my husband can go for 10. And that, to me, means that, yes, there are far more opportunities for men, because I know for a fact that that's across the board too. Have we ever had a female Premier League coach or manager? I don't think so. And so if you are going to go down that route, if you're going to stay in the sporting world, I do believe, that there is way more opportunity for the men than there are the female. And actually, I would probably say that is across the board, isn't it? Like if I was to go into an office job, are they 50-50? Are they male dominant? I mean, I don't have the statistics, but I would say most probably are male dominant. And so, yeah, I would say there are far more opportunities for men in retired life than there are female.
Thank you very much. Now, last question before I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if they have any questions. But people often want to make a difference to gender equality, but they don't know maybe where to start, what they can actually do. Do you have any advice for allies in the audience or online who want to promote gender equality in sport? What would your advice be?
For me, is you've got to keep talking about it, and you've got to go and knock on the door to absolutely anyone that will listen who you think could possibly make a change. And from the athlete side of you, obviously I'm so newly retired, athletes too need to speak and share their experiences. You need to keep sharing, and you need to keep good or bad, because ultimately a good experience can actually help someone else change the way that they're thinking. So good or bad, but everyone needs to keep talking, because without the people voicing their opinions and without people saying, hang on a minute, I don't think this is fair, it's never going to change. And I just think it's not the people that shout loudest, like don't go in, all guns blazing. But I would say you've got to be consistent. You've got to keep bringing out what you are feeling, and you've got to keep asking these people. And don't feel scared to ask someone a question that might get a kickback, because ultimately it might be a question that can change a sports team, and that will make a huge difference to women in sport.
Speak out. Audience, are there any questions to ask Dame Laura? Yeah. Brilliant, please.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Nadia Ernster. I'm the Luxembourg ambassador and co-chair of the Friends of Gender at OECD. So I'm delighted to be here today. And I wanted to thank both Dame Laura and the predecessor for the valuable experience they've been exchanging with us. Because equal pay is essential for an inclusive, well-functioning democratic society in sports and all over the board. So sports have the advantage of visibility. So I know that many women are putting very high hopes into sportswomen to launch the movement. So that's for the pressure I'm putting on you. We are watching you, and we're hoping that you will start the movement. So unfortunately, as you have both been saying, the pay gap is still massive in sports, in media coverage, in infrastructure, and protection in sports for women is still lagging behind, which is appalling, even though some progress has been made over the past years. So this leads me to 2 questions. First, do you think that the Olympics and Paralympics, where women have been quite well represented, are going to change anything? I have been to many female competitions, and I've seen that there was a massive public enthusiasm for this. Crowds were cheering the female rugby players, and it was great to see that the Stade de France was full of people. So I wonder, how have you experienced this? And then overall, we notice there is a regression on women's rights in our societies. I'm thinking about abortion laws in the United States. I'm thinking about the situation in Iran, in Afghanistan, where it's getting worse. I also think about the situation in OECD countries overall, where the young generation often thinks that women's rights are not as important as we considered them, my generation. Voilà, so there is this regression, and I wondered, do you feel it in sports as well, or hasn't this tide arrived at sports yet? Thank you so much.
All right. So I would say, firstly, I think Paralympic and Olympic coverage and sport, like I said earlier, I hope that because of the way it is presented and because of the coverage that it does get, that is enough to at least spark some sort of imagination, you know, into other brands, and not just the Olympic brands, because the Olympics and the Paralympics obviously have their own sponsors, and they, you know, they get all this like people seeing all their brands printed all over the kits and all over the signs and stuff, and that's great for them. But I just hope that is enough to spark the imagination of so many more brands to bring on these athletes as ambassadors. I do think that could make a huge difference. And I do think it probably will make a difference. You know, the stadiums were full, and it was full of people, you know, who will have a huge influence and can have a huge influence on women's sport if they just step forward and say, you know what, I want to support women in sport. So I'm hopeful that the Olympics does generate something for women in sport. But the only thing I would say is I don't like it when it's a short-term gain. So yes, you see, you know, the next year you might get all the gold medalists that, you know, you'll see them with lots of brand ambassadors, and you'll see them like on cereal boxes and the likes, and that's great for a year, but it needs to be consistent. Like, these brands need to then support the athletes consistently, because I think that is also an issue. In terms of sports kind of taking a step back, I don't feel that personally, because I feel like it is growing. I feel like people are finally starting to listen. I mean, from my experience, and the Lionesses, for example, what they have done for female football over in the UK has been insane. They are now, I would actually argue, probably famous. I hate that word, but some of them are more famous than the men. And so actually I'm feeling like our rights are kind of going up slowly, I would argue, but I do feel like we are sort of going up now. So yeah, I would actually say that I don't feel that in sport, hopefully.
Great. Well, are there any other questions out there in the audience? Okay, we'll go, well, why don't we collect both questions and then you can answer them both. So yes, please.
Hi, I'm Alistair and I work here in Paris at the OECD. Firstly, just want to say a really, really big thank you for taking the time out to speak with us here today. It's really, really inspiring. I was just wondering which sports you think have been the most successful in addressing the gender pay gap, and what lessons you think cycling could learn from them.
Very good. And let's get the second question.
Kia ora, my name's Caroline Bilkey. I'm the New Zealand ambassador here in Paris, and just also watched the Olympics and the Paralympics, and was so proud to see some amazing New Zealand performances, including, you know, the women's rugby. Nadia, I don't know if you were there, but it was very exciting to see a packed Stade de France watching women's rugby. And it was at such a high quality. And I think, I guess that's my question maybe to Joanna as well as you, Laura, about, you know, the idea of an ecosystem, the fact that, you know, you need to have the investment in supporting equity at the junior levels in the communities to support, high standards of coaching, opportunities to play, opportunities to participate in competitions. And that will improve the standard of play and the exposure for the athletes. And then, hopefully the sponsorship and the media attention will follow. I get the impression that media is a bit slow. I don't know who takes the decisions, but when you see these packed stadiums at the FIFA Women's World Cup, for example, these are absolutely record-breaking attendances, and the young people that are being inspired, boys and girls, by singing women's soccer at that level, rugby and other sports. Are the media the ones that are falling behind in terms of responding to the real interest that you see at the, in the stadiums in terms of viewership? Thank you.
Very good. Laura, would you like to answer those questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start with the media one just for a sec. That is a really good point, because the media has such a huge effect, especially nowadays in the way we live. Like, social media is huge. And if you're getting reports through instantly, I'll say about the football again, because that's just the biggest gap that I know of. And so, like, for example, if you sit there on a weekend, like, your feed will just be full of the results and like minute breakdowns of what's happening. And that does have a huge effect on what people see. I mean, now everything is literally on a phone, isn't it? Like, you are there and you are connected to it all the time. And instantly, if you see it instantly, it draws you in. Of course it does. And it will seem like these sports are bigger in a way than what they actually are, because you're seeing so much information about it. But you might only get a little snippet of someone winning, I'll say, an Olympic gold medal. I know I said the Olympics is probably the biggest coverage we get, but you know what I mean? If you just get one little headline, then you're not drawn into it and you're not getting it consistently. So it's not seeming as big. And so that is a very good point. I do think the media has a huge effect on how much coverage, how much attention that these athletes actually get. How you force them, I suppose, to be more on it and be quicker with the like announcing the things, or actually even keeping up to date with a lot of what goes on within women's sport. I don't know. Like, I wouldn't know what to even suggest that these kind of outlets could actually do. But yeah, that is a very good point that I'd actually totally forgotten about, that the media play a huge part in all of this. And then go back to the first question. It's really hard, because I think what the Lionesses did, and the way, I'll just go back to Euros, right? So I was actually at the Commonwealth Games when the Euros were on, and when our women were in that final, and their social media team and the way that our media, our Great British media, got behind them was massive. And then the way that those females since then have kind of captured the imagination of everyone else. They have every opportunity they get to inspire that next generation of girls into sport. And they actually don't care whether it's football, a lot of these Lionesses. I mean, I was with Jill Scott a couple of weeks ago, and she was actually on a velodrome. And just seeing her on a bike will inspire people who just know her as a football player to get on a bike, because they want to do what Jill Scott's doing. And that, for me, I think the way that they built themselves up and the way that their social media team built themselves up around that event, we got to know the personalities, was huge. And that, I think, made the biggest difference. I think actually knowing these footballers before they went into that competition made a huge difference. I would love to see cycling do something like that. I think you've got to strip it back to make it grow. If we could strip it back and slightly, if we could get, I mean, I say strip it back, and I'm about to say if we could get them on Netflix, but the Tour de France have their own Netflix documentary, don't they? But we don't have one for the women. If the women could, if we could strip it back and get to know their personalities, it would grow. It would grow so much faster. And so that, for me, is like, that's just a huge comparison. Like, I just believe what the Lionesses did pre that Euros was absolutely fantastic.
Fantastic. I'm being told that we are running out of time for the Q&A, but there is time for one more question. If there's another question from the audience, great. Thank you very much. Yes. Who's got the? All right. Sorry, the microphone went to the back, but it's coming. Fantastic.
Hi, I'm Sophie Power. I've got a campaign for equality of women in sport called She Races. You talked about how British cycling was super supportive of when you could have your babies and it was going through the first time. Can you talk a little bit how your sponsors took the same news and how they supported you through pregnancies? And do you see any change in how brands are working with athletes now as they become mothers?
That's a good question. So again, initially I was terrified. So when I actually fell pregnant, my contracts were coming to an end. Because we work in Olympic cycles, most contracts will be 2 or 4 years, ending the December after the Olympic Games. Now I fell pregnant in the November. And so I'm like, right, what do I do with this information? I don't technically feel like I want to tell anyone before the 12 weeks, but I can't sign a contract knowing that I'm lying because I am pregnant and I'm ultimately not going to be able to perform for the next, well, say 12 months, but you know what I mean, for the bit that I am pregnant and then the bit when I'm getting back into it. So I decided actually to speak to my management team, tell my management team and tell them that they had to speak to my sponsors and they had to be honest and tell them. I thought that's it, like this is going to be it. And I'd heard Alison Felix, because obviously she set up her own brand, didn't she, post? And when she had the horror of basically losing her contract because she was pregnant, I just thought, how am I going to do this? Like, this is it. Like, I'm literally going to lose everything. But for me, actually, they were really supportive. I mean, yes, it's difficult. Obviously, I appreciate that when you are sponsored by someone, they want you to race and they want you to win gold medals. And so if you're not giving them that, then what are you actually giving them? But we just worked across the year. We basically, for the majority of my sponsors, we said, look, the first 12 months, I can just be the person and then I'll be the bike rider. And I had quite a positive experience, I would say, from my own sponsorship deals. But I do think the pressure that you're under to tell people and even to make the decision to pause your career is massive, because in the past it hasn't all been rosy and it hasn't been this nice picture of sponsors just saying, okay, that's fine, like we'll carry on as normal and it will all be fine. People have been like the contracts cut short. So for me, yeah, like I say, I'm painting this rosy picture, but I know it's not always like that. I just think we should maybe have the same. I mean, British Cycling actually have a pregnancy policy now in place. And it's just basically guidelines that you follow and they're brilliant. And so everyone knows what page you're on. So the minute you do fall pregnant, you're on the pregnancy policy and everyone knows where you stand. Should brands maybe have a pregnancy policy for athletes? Probably, because then everyone knows where you are. It's not even then a case of saying, well, hang on a minute, I might lose my contract. It will be a case of just referring to the pregnancy policy bit, and it might say, you know, you have 6 months to get back to fitness, or you have 12 months to get back to fitness, whatever it shall be. But then no one can argue. The athlete can't say, oh, I need more time, and the brand can't say, look, we need her now, we need her to be riding a bike, because you've both signed up to the same thing.
Well, Dame Laura, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. It's been absolutely our pleasure and our privilege to listen to you. Shall we do the usual? Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. For our last segment, before we'll go to a coffee break, we've got another superstar joining us this time from the other side of the world. Thank you so much for staying up so late. Ms. Elizabeth Broderick, founder and convener of the Champions of Change Coalition in Australia, bringing together influential captains of industry, sport, government to target gender inequality, including through an industry-specific group on gender equality in sport. And alongside all this incredibly impressive work, you're also the former UN Special Rapporteur for Discrimination against Women and Girls and former Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner. We're really lucky to have you to say a few words on how you managed to persuade some of Australia's most powerful business people to drive change. And I know that you'll also come to answer some questions after the break. But please, over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I'm certainly not a superstar in the athletic states. I feel very, very humbled here. I'm sitting at this end of the world and just so inspired by both Joanna and Dame Laura for the powerful words and stories to which we can really relate in this end of the world as well. So, and it does, as I listen to that, it fills me with hope, but it also fills me with some sadness as well. So it's wonderful to be here with you. I come to the issue of gender equality in sport wearing a couple of hats, as Mark says, as the former UN Special Rapporteur on discrimination against women and girls, and also the founder and convener of the Champions of Change Coalition, which is a strategy and a social movement to engage power so as to shift systems, and particularly in sport. So in both those roles, I've seen the impact of women and girls in sport. And I have to say, when I go with my colleagues on country missions, one of the first things I look for, usually when I'm driving in from the airport in any country, I look to see whether girls are playing sport in the streets, in the parks, in the back alleys, because if I see girls playing sport, that tells me something about gender equality in that country. But I think most relevantly, over the last decade, I've had the privilege of leading a coalition of sports CEOs in Australia who are dedicated to gender equality and pay equity. And when I talk about the group, I'm talking about the CEOs of all the major sporting codes here in Australia, and also the CEOs of some of the biggest sporting clubs in the country, and indeed the overarching regulatory and government authority, the Australian Sports Commission, all coming together in a group for collective action. And that group's called the Champions of Change for Sport. So more recently, we've captured our work in our soon-to-be-released 10-year report, which we've decided as a group to name Unstoppable, because that's what we need to be if we're to create a shift in pay equity in sport. So what I wanted to do in the few minutes is just to share some of the lessons that I've learned over the last 10 years in how to achieve greater levels of gender equality, pay equity in sport. And I think the most important lesson that I've learned and that you can take away from me today is that progress doesn't come by chance. I think we've heard it from the other speakers, but the progress we've seen in Australia has been the result of deliberate, coordinated and systematic action. And at the heart of that action was collaboration. So yes, the first lesson is that the leadership to shift systems, it has to be intentional, visible and unwavering. So it's not about making statements or setting goals. It's actually about relentless, visible action. CEOs and boards of sporting organisations across the country have made gender equality a strategic priority. And when they do that, everything changes, because it's no longer about just ticking the boxes. It's about embedding gender equality in the DNA of organisations. What I've found is that CEOs are much bolder in the group than they would be individually. Each CEO wants to outdo the others. So I kind of benefit from that really public commitment, but also the competitive nature, because most of them are men, most of them are leading sporting organisations, and that's been really beneficial. And what I would say is that consistently over the decade, where you've got a group who represent the major sporting organisations in the country step up on gender equality, however imperfectly, that sets the tone for the entire sports ecosystem. So leadership, number one. Lesson two is really about transparency and measurement. You can't manage what you don't measure. So when we started our work 10 years ago, we didn't have a framework to track progress on gender equality and pay equity in sport. We were fortunate to get McKinsey, the global consultants, to come behind us. And together with them, we developed the Pathway to Pay and Gender Equality Framework. And we stepped out 26 key measures, which we have now tracked and reported on annually for the past 5 years. Not only have we reported on them, we make the results public to the world. And that framework that we developed with McKinsey is freely available. I'm very happy to disseminate that at the Champions of Change website. But just to give you an indication of how that transparency's changed the game, in 2019, only 43% of our CEOs were leading organisations that gave equal prize money for men and women. Today, I'm pleased to say that that number stands at nearly 90%. So just making transparent the data forced us to confront some really uncomfortable truths. The other thing that's more recently happened in our group is that the Sports Commission has set a target of 50% women, 50% men for sports leadership and governance if that sporting organisation wants to receive government funding. And organisations need to hit that target by 2027. So just the third lesson is we've learned that pathways matter and they must be designed for women. It's not about simply retrofitting women into men's programs because that's a certain route to failure. So our national cricket, football, rugby, tennis organisations now have very clear pathways to elite participation for women. And indeed, 82% of our member organisations would report gender balance in the development pathways. So put simply, if you want to retain women in sport, build the system they need and deserve. And then just my second last lesson, lesson 4, which is around culture. I mean, one of the reasons women don't stay in sport or indeed in sporting organisations is that the culture's not safe, inclusive and respectful. And I think what we've come to recognise is that harmful gendered norms continue to persist, and that has an impact particularly on women who can face exclusion, harassment and discrimination. So it's essential that that long-term work on culture is done in sporting organisations. And then my final lesson is that that pay equity requires much more than good intentions. It requires investment and structural change. We must address the systemic barriers to unequal access to resources. So while we've made progress on prize money equality, we still have 50% of our organisations which will still have some form of gender pay gap at the elite level. Now, some of the organisations have moved ahead very quickly. Cricket Australia, Tennis Australia, Football Australia, they have been at the front end of pay equality, and they've gifted back their IP to help every other sport build their own pathway to accelerate change. The other thing that has happened is that other private sector organisations across the Champions of Change Coalition are now moving to sponsor sport, but only on the basis that the sporting organisation uses that sponsorship equally for men and women. So that is closing some of the gap in investment. And indeed, we've done quite a strong case study on Football Australia, the Women's World Cup, which, as Joanna was saying, just also changed the game. I think in the World Cup last year in Australia, we had around 2 billion global viewers and 2 million spectators. So, you know, who's to say that women's sport isn't as attractive as men's sport? So I think just finally, the time's come to actually fix the unequal systems of the past. It's not about incremental progress. It's actually about strong and bold action. And it's about envisioning a future of gender equality and pay equity in sport so that we can be the generation that closes the gap for good. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing those very insightful comments. Colleagues, we're going to have a short break now before we have a panel discussion afterwards. So those of you joining us online, don't go anywhere, or rather you can go somewhere for the next 15 minutes, but then please do come back. Those of you here in person, there's coffee just outside the room. At 15 minutes, we'll restart again just after 3:30. Okay, thanks very much. We'll second round of this discussion this afternoon. We're going to have a panel discussion. That's going to be the main thing that we'll do this afternoon. But in order to kick us off, to help us make sense of the magnitude and drivers of pay gaps in sports, basically set the scene for the panel discussion, we're joined online by one of the great academic experts on this topic, Mr. David Berry, who is a professor of economics and the department chair at Southern Utah University. It's 6 a.m. in the morning. You've got dressed. If I were you, I would have had terrible problems with my camera. I would still be there wearing my pajamas and I would just be a disembodied voice, but you're looking terribly smart. Thank you, David. You've spent a couple of decades researching sports and economics, including gender issues. And so you're going to give us some scene setting remarks before we get to the panel discussion. Over to you, David.
Very much. Thank you for having me here. I promised my dean that I would wear a tie. All right, let me, I'm very honored to introduce what I think is going to be just a fantastic panel. So as noted, I've spent many years talking about sports and economics, and my co-authors and I have done a great deal of research on gender and economics. Recently, Neff Walker and I wrote an entire book on gender and economics called Slaying the Trolls. And much of what we talk about contradicts the story that many, it's men. It's mostly what men tell about gender and sports. I'm just going to start off with this, just a simple example here. Steph Curry gets paid $62 million a year to hit really long shots and never dunk a basketball. Caitlin Clark gets paid $76,000 to do essentially exactly the same job. So they get paid very different amounts to do something very similar. The answer that many people give who've taken a little bit of economics, but not very much, is that, well, men's sports earns billions of dollars in revenue, and women's sports simply does not. So that explains the difference, and that's the end of the story. It's all about magical markets. That's not really the story. I think we want to go through, as we talk about these issues, and deal with some myths and some background that explains why we see these differences, and then briefly talk about how much of a gender pay gap still exists, even when you take into account the revenue issue. So sort of myth number one is this idea that men's sports, and men will often say this, men's sports are simply better than women's sports. There are certain sports that the very top men will do better than the very top women. So if you think about running a 100-meter dash, the very top men do better than the very top women. But there are other sports where that's not true. It also doesn't matter in the slightest. It doesn't make a difference whether women can beat men in sports. That is irrelevant. And the reason why it's irrelevant is because historically we don't rank athletes in an absolute sense. We rank them in a relative sense. And the best example of that is you think about a sport like boxing. If absolute ability made a difference, then there would be no such thing as middleweight boxing or lightweight boxing. A man who weighs 110 pounds cannot beat a man who weighs 250 pounds in a boxing match. That can't happen. And yet people will watch two middleweights or two lightweights fight in a boxing match and think this is really great, even though they can't absolutely be the best boxers in the world. Men, though, will rank middleweight boxers ahead of heavyweight boxers. Men don't, and there's all sorts of other examples. In America, we have a thriving college sports industry that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. That only exists because people are looking at the athletes in a relative sense, not in an absolute sense. So women don't have to be men to be better than men. It is irrelevant. Men don't rank men that way. It is also the case, and we've done research on this as well. There was a wonderful ad during the World Cup last year in France for the Women's World Cup team in France, where they illustrated that if you take the women athletes and you make them appear to be men, that they look very much like men playing sports and women playing sports looks essentially the same. We did actually an academic article on this. Carlos Gonzalez was the lead author on this. He was very good in putting the study together, where we did a study and we looked at, can you actually tell the difference when you blur the gender between men and women playing sports? And the answer is people cannot do that. So Billie Jean King never really had to beat Bobby Riggs to prove that women's tennis is valuable. Caitlin Clark doesn't have to be better than Steph Curry for us to think that women's basketball is valuable. Women don't have to do that. So that's myth number one. So why is there a revenue difference? Okay, it's discrimination. That's the story. It's simply discrimination. And we've already talked about this some today. There is a long history of men discriminating against women in sports. And so we can just some basic examples of this. England famously banned women's soccer until 1972. College sports in the United States, which trains many of the Olympians in sports around the world, wasn't made equal for men and women until 1972. The FIFA's Women's World Cup only goes back to 91. The WNBA only goes back to 1997. And as we noted, the Tour de France for women only goes back 3 years. I mean, so there's just this long history of not making this equal for men and women. So the big reason why men's sports has a revenue advantage and an attendance advantage is because they had a huge head start. And we know from the history of men's sports that in the early years of men's professional leagues, there simply were no fans. People did not show up to watch the English Premier League when it started, or the NBA when it started, or the National Football League when it started. It took time, decades, to build a fan base, and women have not been given that same opportunity. There's also a big difference in investment. Men tend to think that they built these sports all by themselves, but they have received, certainly in the United States, they have received billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies that are not made available to women. It is the case that around the world, men's sports tends to get a far more government support than women do. It is also the case on the private sector side that investors tend to favor men's sports over women's sports, even when it doesn't look like the return, the investment return would actually be there. We mentioned earlier today that the highest valued women's sports team in the world is in the National Women's Soccer League. It's worth $250 million. That is less than what they're selling Major League Soccer teams for in the US. And Major League Soccer is not Major League Soccer. It's minor league soccer. The top soccer leagues in men's sports are in Europe. And so we don't value the women the same way as the men. And the women are asked, when they are asking for investors, they are treated, and we note this in our book, women get treated as if they are operating a cardboard factory or just any run-of-the-mill business. They are asked to provide monthly financial statements, and investors wonder whether they'll make a profit or not. When men invest in men, there's a long history of this. Men investing in men's sports don't seem very concerned about there being a profit. That's why in North American sports, one of the reasons why these exist, they put salary caps in place to prevent men from spending all their money. In the English Premier League, men have spent more money than the revenue they brought in to pay for players. Men invest in men very differently than they're investing in women, and we have to note that. We've noted the media story. Women do not get covered the same way men get covered. It is the case that the sports media is dominated by men. Men decide what coverage is going to be. When women are covered, that coverage is sporadic. We don't put women's sporting events on TV on a consistent basis where people will know the game is going to be on this particular day or this particular night. I know it's going to be there. I know that's the time I'm going to watch it. When it comes to women's sports, it is often the case that you have to hunt around to find when it's going to be covered, what channel will it be on, what time will it be on. They move it around a lot. Nobody would think that you could actually make a television show successful if you randomly put the show on and didn't put it on a specific night where people could find it. But they do that for women's sports all the time. So the coverage isn't the same. The way in which we present this is simply not the same. And that affects how much revenue there is and how much money there is to pay the women. So now, take all that away and you say, okay, that explains why the revenue is different. But even controlling for the size of the revenue, it is still the case there is a substantial gender wage gap in sports. In the NBA pays 50% of its basketball-related income to its players. The WNBA, we know this from an article that was written in Bloomberg, from 2019 to 2023, WNBA revenue went from 100 million to 200 million. It doubled in the middle of a pandemic. It was phenomenal rate of economic growth. And so the WNBA is growing. And I would note that growth, that $100 million to $200 million leap, it mirrors exactly, adjusted for inflation, the same leap the NBA made at the same point in its history. The NBA revenue also went from 100 million to 200 million in its third decade in a span of a few years. So in terms of growth, it's very similar, but in terms of pay, it's not. Right now, today, the top player in the WNBA is actually paid less, substantially less, than the top player in the NBA was paid 50 years ago. 50 years ago, NBA revenue was $30 million a year. They paid Kareem Abdul-Jabbar $400,000 to play basketball. The top player in WNBA gets paid $250,000. The WNBA players get less than 10% of their league revenue. NBA players get 50% of the revenue. And the NBA owns half the WNBA. So this is discrimination being done by men who own both leagues. We see the same story in other sports. We see that National Women's Soccer League, it pays less than 30% of its revenue to its players. English Premier League does not do that. They pay something around 50, 60, 70% of the revenue to their players. There are actually teams in the English Premier League, again, who've paid more revenue to their players than more salary to their players than revenue they had. Tennis is equal for the Grand Slams. It's not equal outside the Grand Slams. The list goes on and on and on. So I think the big story that I would tell here is we have to stop pretending that this is some kind of market story. This is not a market story. This is a discrimination story. And we have to take, as was said earlier, we have to take concerted action to deal with the discrimination issue and not hope that there's some kind of magic free market that's going to fix this for us. So thank you. That's my basic story.
Great. Thanks, David. That's a brilliant way for setting the scene for our panel discussion, which we're going to start now. It's entitled Pay Equity in Sports, What's Stopping Us and How Do We Get There? So we're going to focus first on barriers to pay equity and then start looking at solutions. And to discuss all these things, we have a phenomenal panel. So let me introduce who we have. First of all, to my left, Miss Julia George, External Communications Lead at Women in Sport, a non-profit in the UK working to improve opportunities for women and girls in sport. Julia was also an award-winning presenter with the BBC before moving to this job. Thora Helgadottir is a former professional footballer with 108 caps for Iceland. She played in Iceland, Australia, Norway, Sweden, 2 European Championships, 8 Icelandic Championship titles, 4 Cup titles. Very impressive. You already know Joanna. Welcome back to the stage, Joanna. And we also finally on stage have Miss Sophie Power, who is an ultramarathon runner. You still do ultramarathons, do you? Yeah, you still do. Yeah. And founder of She Races, a non-profit working for equality for female athletes. We also have 2 panelists online. We're welcoming back Elizabeth Broderick, who's you heard was the founder and convener of Champions of Change Coalition in Australia. And we also have Sarah Gregorius, the former professional and international footballer who won 100 caps, not quite as many as you thought. You should gloat a bit. 100 caps for New Zealand. Sorry about that, Sarah, that was very rude of me. You did play in 3 World Cups and 2 Olympics. You were formerly at FIFPro, the Global Football Players Union, and you've recently been appointed Senior Director of Sporting at the US National Women's Soccer League. You did play for Liverpool but I'm going to try very hard not to be biased against you because of that. So let's dive straight in to hear from the panelists, and let me start with you, Julia. We know that gender equality starts early, and that's no surprise in both in aspirations and participation. But I know your organizations, you've talked about a gendered dream deficit in sports, meaning that fewer girls dream of becoming elite athletes. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea and what's causing it?
Yeah, of course. In the simplest terms, it's exactly as you just described it. This is the massive difference between the number of boys who dream of, who genuinely believe and are motivated to reach the top in sport, and the number of girls who can believe and dream the same thing. So this is what we did. We're emerging from lockdown in 2020, and Women in Sport collected baseline data and then rigorously followed the attitudes after high-profile women's events. And from 2020 to 2023, there was no shortage of them. So we had things like, for the first time, the England team making the World Cup finals in netball, which was a huge deal in my country. We had them making the World Cup finals in rugby union. We had a Brit, unbelievably a female Brit, winning a tennis Grand Slam. We had the beginning of the 100 cricket tournament. We had a Summer Olympic Games, Winter Olympic Games, home Commonwealth Games, and of course, it's been referenced already, the inexorable rise of our lionesses. And I'm going to start with the good news, because when we went back to our cohort of girls and boys in 2023, of the girls, 9 out of 10 of them said after watching that World Cup, they were proud and they were happy. 9 out of 10 of them. That is wonderful. But while seeing women at the top of their game undoubtedly makes a difference to younger generations of girls, think about Joanna talking about her dream when she was at the White House watching the 99ers arrive. That isn't enough on its own for most girls. So after these incredible women's events in 2023, we asked the boys about their dream rate. It was 52%. More than half of them said, we believe, we dream of making it to the top in sport. And for girls, it was 29%, less than a third. That is the dream deficit. And it comes about, and we learn about how it comes about, looking at some of the other questions that we asked these girls. They said 82% of girls say they believe that women's sport is taken less seriously. And they told us they were appalled by the public display of misogyny by the Spanish former head of the Football Federation. And I don't name check misogynists. They told us that the barriers they were experiencing, more than half of them said that they hate being watched when they take part in sport. I'm just talking about ordinary girls. They feel judged. They don't feel good enough. 41% said we are not good enough to pursue our sports. And this is a really interesting one. 38% told us, and this includes, the reason it's an interesting percentage is this includes the girls who really do describe themselves as the most sporty, that they don't like doing sport when they've got their period. In 1984, our founders, it's our 40th anniversary this year, in 1984, they said that they wanted sport to be a normal part of life for every girl and woman in our country. Professor Margaret Talbot, one of our incredible founders, said, when you see what sport does for girls, you want more of them to have it. It's 2024. The dream deficit is telling us that we've still got a really long way to go.
Yeah, and you think the dream deficit is linked to the pay gap? Does the pay gap explain the deficit, or the deficit explain the pay gap?
I think it's a vicious circle. If you can't make it to elite sports, then you can't earn that money. And if you're not participating, we've done research that suggests there's 1.3 million English girls who are at risk of or are dropping out of sport after primary school. That's where the massive drop-off happens. So you can't earn money at all if you're not there, and you certainly can't be paid well if you're not there. And they are hearing the message about money, because we asked them about this, and 3/4 of them said to us, we don't think professional sportswomen are earning enough. And 77% of them, more than 3/4, said they were demoralized by the funding and the sponsorship deals. And that's ordinary girls, not elite sportswomen.
Yeah. Okay, Thor, let's turn to you. You were a professional footballer for many years. What's your perspective on how things have evolved since you started playing? You know, how was it at the beginning in terms of visibility? how much has changed since then?
So it depends how far back we go. If we go back to the time when I started, when I was 5, I think I can safely say we were at a 0. There was no age group for me to train in. There was no sort of organized trainings. I was the annoying 5-year-old that would just show up to trainings for 12-year-olds. Was basically just in the way. There was no national team. It had been cut due to cost during those years. So yeah, safe to say at a 0. No sort of access to the same fields as the boys, access to locker rooms, equipment, things like that. And then slowly but surely, you know, things got added that we were allowed to sort of use and do, I guess. When I was 12, the national team was reinstated, which, I mean, I think everyone realizes the importance of having a national team. You need the role models for all the girls playing. And then, you know, slowly we got access to the same fields, decent training hours. That was another fight. We had to wait until all the boys were done before we could get on the pitches. And then up to, you know, getting a small amounts of money paid, access to equipment, things like that. And all the way up to the federation making the pay equal between the players. Now I can't remember what year it was, 2017 maybe, something like that. So really, really big strides. And so when I see now, you know, women's clubs being sold for a huge profit in the US and a friend of mine signing a deal in Saudi Arabia, I mean, that's just something that I didn't think was going to happen. But there's a big but, and I'm going to reveal my age here. It's 40 years this has taken. So we're not crazy far along. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but we came from 0. So it's only, I don't know, when I was in Sweden, there was a big celebration at the end of the year gala for the man who reached the highest caps, 140 something. And I was sitting next to my teammate, Teres Sjögren, who had played over 200 games. And they did a special ceremony where they handed him a car. And we were just sitting there like eating soup. And Zlatan Ibrahimovic put out a tweet that, yeah, sure, I can buy the women a bike. Stop whining. I mean, I think this is maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So, I mean, I think we can be sort of happy with the progress, but we're nowhere near done, as we've seen.
What do you think are the current biggest barriers that you'd like to see?
Well, apart from everything we've discussed today, I think it's the mentality of the leadership that needs to change. If you look at UEFA just came out with a 6-year plan. It's a 38-page paper of you know, their vision and mission statement, and it's all very equal and inclusive, and it's all about social responsibility, and the actions are not matching the words, in my opinion.
Right. I'm going to go online because we haven't heard from Sarah yet. So let me go to you, Sarah. You've been advocating for better working conditions for players, clubs and national teams around the world. That's been your job. Reflecting on those efforts, what would you say are some of the most common obstacles that you and the players have been encountering?
That's a good question, and thanks for having me with you guys virtually today. There's a couple of things that I think are internal to sort of like the playing community, and a couple of things that are external, which will just be a bit repetitive from some of the previous answers. The things that are external are, you know, attitudes in decision-making environments. Definitely feels, certainly for players, very deliberate that certain decisions are taken that are obviously very discriminatory and steeped in misogyny, and we tend to find ourselves kept out of those rooms very deliberately so that people who have to make those decisions don't have to face up to the people who are affected by those decisions. I will also say, though, in my experiences, whether that's with my national team or the clubs that I've played for, or in my work with other playing groups, is if someone tells you you're not worth it enough times, you start to believe it. And sometimes there is a real barrier that needs to be broken down within the players themselves, of them realizing their own worth and their own value. And I think a lot of the time, not only are players told that they're not worthy of the investment, they're also told to be grateful for what they have. And so this gratitude attitude is really something that needs to be overcome in order for you to push for what you deserve and push for what you value. So I think if you combine those two things together, it can create some pretty significant internal and external obstacles for players being able to advocate and fight for change and raise their voice to be heard by those decision makers. And what I will say is there's a very ugly history within women's football in particular of when players have been advocates and have been activists, they've lost their careers. They've never played for that national team again, or they've never played for that club again. I sort of experienced this myself. You know, once you start sticking up for yourself, you get labeled as a troublemaker. You get labeled as a difficult person to manage, and you know, not a very compliant employee. So I think there are so many different things, but from a sort of macro and micro perspective, I think those are the major ones. And we do have to do a lot of work with players, a lot of work with women and girls sometimes, and just encouraging them to realize their own value. And that's just really heartbreaking work sometimes, because that's when you hear the stories about how they've inherited this particular perspective and what they've had to go through.
I mean, collective bargaining has generally, not always, but generally has been effective in reducing gender pay gaps. I mean, do you see any possibility of improving the kind of collective bargaining, including internationally, in order to make more progress, particularly in the football area, or is it always going to be individuals who are making action?
No, I'm a former unionist. I'm a firm believer in the power of collective bargaining and the power of collective action for a couple of reasons. I think when you have a group of players that are organized into a collective, they're also protected, you know, because you're speaking with one voice instead of relying on individuals to sort of stick their head above the parapet. So I'm a huge believer in not just collective bargaining, but collective action and representation, because I think it is a way for players to bring a perspective forward or bring their needs forward, but also remain a little bit protected, whether that's behind a player association or a union. And then obviously there are certain things that can be governed in a collective bargaining situation that can be very, not only just equitable, but very progressive as well. And I think if you have an opportunity to represent a particular group and you can really hone in on their needs, actually you can make sure that we're not just getting equality and equity, but, you know, equal outcomes and justice for behavior that has gone on in the past. So it's a wonderful mechanism. It's obviously it's very contextual as well. Like some of those relationships in terms of labor are governed by state or federal law, and it's not so simple to achieve, but certainly collective bargaining is an incredible mechanism for change. It's one that protects and promotes the well-being of players, certainly. And I think put it this way, it's no mistake that some of the best women's football leagues in the world have collective bargaining agreements in place. I think it also leads eventually to a much better on-field product, because you have players that are protected and able to feel safe in a sustainable environment and thrive.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could move to you, Elizabeth, because I want to pick up on something that David was very, very critical of in his remarks about that commercial case, the argument that women athletes can't be paid equitably because they generate less revenue than men. Presumably you've come across this argument in your interactions in Australia. What do you make of the argument?
Yeah, I hear that quite a bit, Mark, and I agree with David's analysis. I thought it was excellent analysis, because often we'll hear from sporting organisation that private sector, organisations say, well, I can get a better return on investment if I invest in the men. Actually, if you were looking solely at upside, you'd say investing in the women is a much better proposition because there's likely to be much greater upside. I mean, if I just look at the Matildas, which is the Australian women's soccer team or football team, they're now the powerhouse of football in our country following the Women's World Cup in 2023. As I said, they had 2 million people come to watch the World Cup and over 2 billion global viewership, and the amount of merch that went out the door. And interestingly, the fan base shifted as well. There were many more families and women coming to watch the games, and that actually had an impact on how the fans reacted in the stadiums in a more respectful way, actually, than we might have seen in the past. So overall, it was a much more positive story. And I think helping a private sector, who are the major sponsors of sport, plus the government, of course, but helping them see the significant upside in women's sport is really important. The one other thing I'd say, Mark, is with the Champions of Change Coalition. So we have 270 of the most powerful CEOs in the country as part of this strategy. And in that cohort, we would have a lot of CEOs of media companies, of big corporate organizations who fund a lot of sport. So the ability to talk to them using the human stories, I think, is a really good way of engaging CEOs' hearts as well as their heads and saying, look, in the future, for each of you who are big sponsors of sport, it's about saying, okay, well, we'll sponsor your sport, but only if you give equally to both men and women, because that actually shifts the investment profile as well. And we've got some wonderful examples of that. I mean, Commonwealth Bank, for example, our largest bank in Australia, doing exactly that and encouraging many, many other organisations to do likewise. So I think there's some great opportunity there. But David's framing, I think, is really spot on.
That's both good news and very depressing that he's spot on, but good news that at least you've made some progress in some areas. Sophie, thank you for waiting. Look, you're an ultramarathon runner, but you've also been a campaigner and advisor. Can we get the photo up? There was a photo of Sophie which went viral in 2018. And it's an unbelievably striking photo. Oops. There we go. Yeah. Do you want to tell us about the story behind this photo?
Sure. So this is a photo taken at a race called UTMB, the Ultra Trail de Mont Blanc, which is a 106-mile mountain race around Mont Blanc, climbing over 10,000 meters. And this is taken at Cormann, which is about the halfway point. And little baby, he's now 6 and a big chunk, but he's 3 months old. And the guy next to me is asleep because we've been running since 6 o'clock the night before. It's 10 a.m. I've had no sleep and I'd like some sleep, but I've got a much more important job to do. And the reason it's there, and this is a race that's kind of the world championships of trail running. And it takes a long time to qualify for, to get a place. And I lost a place in 2014 with my first son, because they wouldn't defer for pregnancy because it was a choice. If I was injured, I'd have had a deferral, but pregnancy was a choice and they said no. And I finally get another place and I've got a 3-month-old baby and I wasn't going to lose my place again. And so I decided to run, and my 3-year-old wanted to finish because you run through the streets of Chamonix. Actually, we did kind of 2 weeks ago with another race coming back to it. And so I finished the race. And I think this photo went viral for so many reasons. I think one is just there's a woman breastfeeding in public, which sadly is really not the norm in many cultures. Women don't feel confident as they should do. But I think the other reason is that it showed this was ridiculous, that I could not run that race when I was healthy, and talking about women getting back to sport after having babies, and the fact that elite athletes, and not just kind of recreational, I only actually got my first GB vest after I had all my 3 children, could still have athletic dreams. And our athletic dreams and our careers should not have to end with motherhood. And so what happened afterwards was lots of races realized that they had these policies in place where you couldn't defer your entry, or an elite couldn't even get into the race, never mind kind of recreational runner, and they start putting them in place. But it led to so much more. There's so many other barriers to taking part in a race as a woman. And so I founded She Races, which is all about how do we get more women on start lines, give women a much better experience when we're participating. And I guess what we're talking about today, the kind of pay gap, how do we equally value that female race? Because in my sport, we mix men and women on start lines. The same thing in triathlon, same thing in kind of the road running, trail running. And how do we make sure we're equally valuing those women? Prize money is the very tiny part of it. It's that equal media coverage, as an equal respect. It's the equal social media. It's the pulling the women to the front of the race so we can see them in the pictures. So all of these conversations started kind of around motherhood, but then it's expanded really into what is stopping us as female athletes.
I mean, for those who haven't managed to do the maths in their head, 106 miles is 170 kilometers. I mean, insane. How much has changed since then? Have things changed, at least in your area?
I think quite a lot's changed. I think seeing the photo sparked debates all around the world, really, about motherhood and athletes and elites getting back and the right we have as women to sport. Like, sport is a fundamental right of ours. It's joy, it's liberation, it's competition. And it's so important for us to have that equality in sport, because that translates into the business. It translates into all parts of our lives. In races, a lot of races have the pregnancy policies now. A lot of races, with She Races, we develop these very simple, basic guidelines to encourage more women to start lines. We're different to men. We react differently to language. We need a different kind of, we want to see ourselves in media to know that we will be valued. We need period products. We'd like some toilets. But I think in the elite side, when we talk about pay, what we're trying to do is increase the visibility. And that race, that UTMB race, had equal separate media teams, the male and female race, the first time this year. And we're suddenly seeing these female athletes. We're suddenly seeing people actively push them to the front so we can get the photo of them. So there's an awful lot that has changed, but we're still so much to go in terms of participation, so much to go in terms of truly valuing the female performance separately to the men's, because we are two absolutely separate races. And really making sure that our sport is designed for women as well as being designed for men. And it is different. And most race directors and most kind of leaders in sport are male, designing sport, designing those pathways for men. And we need to make sure that women have the same opportunities to perform as a man.
I think we've got on to the second part of the discussion, which is really looking at what we would be doing in order to, the solutions, I suppose, and practical approaches to promoting pay equity. I wonder, maybe we should start with you, Joanna. I mean, the Equal Pay for Team USA Act, it's already been mentioned today, was pretty amazing to get this through. How important is it? What do you see is the role of government as opposed to the athletes and the people who pay the athletes, the sports people?
Government has an extremely essential role in closing the pay gap. This goes back even to 1972, where Title IX was passed in the United States, which has been a pivotal piece of legislation. And we've been able to build on that legislation consistently over time, now having the Equal Pay Team USA Act. And government are our systems. I'm reminded of a favorite quote from an author, James Clear, is, "We don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems." And our systems are failing female athletes. They are not established for female athletes to thrive. They are established for us to survive. And I think it really starts and ends with that legislation piece. And that is the beginning. And then once we have the legislation, we can incentivize and really provide, I would say, tax breaks, funding for organizations and teams and that actually do the right thing. And then you have the public accountability piece, which really allows the public to see what companies, corporations, teams are doing the right thing. Because a lot of spending now in Generation Z, as we say in the United States, is based around companies who are value driven, who have a mission. And they will buy the products. A lot of female sports fans will buy the products of the companies that sponsor these athletes. And then you have the public awareness piece, because you can't have behavior change without awareness. So we have to bring that to light. And then really reinforcing the laws. So Women's Sports Foundation is the organization that really enacts Title IX and enforces it in the United States. And we need to ensure that the legislation isn't just out there, that it's actually being followed.
I mean, I suppose the US is still unusual in having that legislation. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that in countries considering having such legislation that you would say, you know, maybe anything that you'd improve in the act, or should you just pick the act as it is? I mean, it works fine.
Yeah, Title IX wasn't even established specifically for sports. It was equal opportunity for young women in schools. And, you know, I would ask my panelists who are not from the United States, what would they choose to have a part of their legislation? Because it's been absolutely monumental in the United States.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should go to Thor, because I mean, basically Iceland is, we always hold up Iceland as of all the OECD countries, the country that government really goes furthest, I suppose, in promoting gender equity. But as you say, I mean, it's still not achieved equity in your area. I mean, is it more that government should do, or what else? Where would you identify where action should take place next?
I think it needs to be a combination. But I think what's been key in Iceland is the society. I mean, back in 1975, women did the first women's strike where they just stood up from their jobs and walked out. I think that was a pretty powerful statement. And ever since then, you know, sponsors and like government, or not governmental bodies, like federations, they don't get away with as much. They do still get away with discrimination, but like earlier, the Women's World Cup, media can't do that in Iceland. They do Men's World Cup and Women's World Cup.
They actually say that. They
unless
have to say.
It's actually playing. You can say World Cup because everyone knows what it is, but it's always the male national team and the female national team. If they wouldn't do that, if they would do, that's the highest capped player, they would get killed because there's a bunch of women with a lot more caps on the national team. So I think it's society that we need to make an outrage. We need to be heard. We need to, you know, be troublemakers, like Sarah says. We need to be, all of us, sort of complaining if it's not good enough. We need to say something.
And really coming back to you, Sarah, I mean, I think one of the striking things, you did get a gender equal collective bargaining agreement in New Zealand, didn't you? What can others learn from that experience that you had?
Well, I mean, New Zealand is not too dissimilar to Iceland, I think, in a lot of ways. When we achieved this, I think it was back in 2018, we had Jacinda Ardern as Prime Minister of New Zealand. We had quite a vocal society on a lot of things related to gender equality and gender equity. One other thing, I wouldn't know if I would say this is a recommendation because it was a bit cheeky. One thing that we did before we actually sat down with the Federation is we went public with our intention as the Players Association. Now, given the context of New Zealand at that time, if the Federation had then responded publicly and said, oh no, we're not doing that, they would have been crucified. There was just absolutely no way that they couldn't embark on that journey with us to reach that eventual outcome. So that was a slight manipulation of the court of public opinion, but it was very effective. One other thing that we did is actually the situation that you have in New Zealand with the national teams is, it's not that the men's contract and the women's contract are the same. It's actually the same document. So whether you or not you play for the men's national team or the women's national team, there is actually just one CBA agreement that covers both. So by nature, it is equal because it covers both men's and women's national team players. So it was really important that we had allyship with the men's national team as well, that they understood the vision, that they were on board with it. And then when we were having the conversations with the Federation, a little bit like what I said earlier, we brought players to the conversation. I was still on the national team back then, and I sat in the room, literally in the boardroom across from the decision makers of the Federation, and they had to look me in the eye and tell me that I wasn't worth the same as the men's national team player sitting next to me. And that completely changed the dynamic. Don't get me wrong, they definitely pushed back and tried to give some of the age-old excuses. But that was, I think, quite a fundamental dynamic shift that they just weren't used to. Like I said earlier, I think if decision makers are removed from the impact of their decisions, it is sometimes easier to just enact discriminatory practices. But if they are face to face with the people who are impacted by those decisions and they have to explain their way out of it, man, it makes people squirm. It was really an uncomfortable and a really tense environment. So I think all of those things just contributed to the outcome that we got, that the players deserved, that we deserved. I wouldn't say that it was an exercise I'd like to repeat every day of my life, but I'm very proud of it.
So the key thing was go public, so already had them on the defensive, and make the alliance then with the male team so that it was joint bargaining. I mean, is that alliance with the men, is that common in negotiations for other countries, do you know?
I know of other examples of it. Obviously, the other major example in recent years is with the US women's national team and the men's national team, with the conversations and the negotiations they had with US soccer. But otherwise, yeah, they tend to treat the national teams quite separately, and sometimes that can be advantageous as well. There can be situations where actually the needs of those particular playing groups are different, so it's necessary to negotiate them differently. But I do think where you can find a lot of strength is in allyship with, if you have male counterparts with them as well. It's a shame really that sometimes you have to rely on it. I do believe that you should be able to value and appreciate and uplift women based on the fact that you just really value that particular group of people for who they are and what they can achieve. But it can be very helpful, and I think can certainly create a bit of a strong alliance. And yeah, it feels a little bit like, people standing alongside each other on a picket line, to use a sort of quite famous analogy from union work.
Very good, very interesting. Elizabeth, I suppose, what slightly different angle that you've been acting on, how do you see the role of the private sector in promoting pay equality? I mean, you've been using them to drive change, and you talked about that in your presentation. Is that a particularly Australian thing, or do you think that could be replicated internationally?
I think it could be replicated internationally. I mean, it's interesting to hear Sarah there talk about football in New Zealand. Same in Australia. It's the male team and the female team coming together as well to ensure pay equality for all national players. Now that only happened in the last few years. I can't remember how many years ago, but we've had that same experience. But coming back to the private sector, Mark, I just think the private sector is often neglected in terms of recognizing the power the private sector has to fund sport. I know in the US, a lot of sporting teams are owned by individual philanthropists. In Australia, it's more likely that as a national sporting organisation or a good sporting team or a club, you will receive funding from large corporate organisations. So to the extent that you can engage particularly power, so that's why we go directly to the CEO. Otherwise, you find yourself stuck in the sponsorship part of the organisation, which sometimes doesn't have the strategic outlook to understand that actually investing in sport and in women is actually to the organisation's benefit. And I think what we try to do is, firstly, we go to the CEO, we say, look, you're one of the champions of change in any event, so you believe fundamentally in gender equality. Well, if you believe in gender equality, then of course you will want in your supply chain and the way you use your power and influence to be furthering gender equality in this country. Therefore, investing in women's sport makes absolutely perfect sense. So to be able to have that kind of conversation rather than we're just another sporting team turning up asking for sponsorship, I think it makes it quite different. And where we're looking for funding also is from the grassroots right up to the elite level, because if you don't have girls coming in the grassroots, you're never going to have, elite women in sporting teams.
Makes a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do now is ask for questions from the audience. I mean, I will come back for one last question to the panel to finish off the whole event. But let's get some questions from the audience first, and the audience that includes online. So does anybody want to kick us off? Any questions about what you've heard so far? And it goes surprisingly quiet. There's all that energy from earlier. Come on. Here we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all of these incredible insights. It's really interesting as a girl who was really, I really played a lot of sports when I was a kid to hear all these things. I'm really fascinated by a lot of the conversations about specific pathways and how you have to nurture at the grassroots level to build that elite level and close the gaps at the elite level. And curious for anybody to reflect on their experiences on kind of what those pathways should look like in their specific sports, what kind of considerations you want to take to make sure that women have pathways specific to their needs in sport relative to men. Thanks.
Okay. I'm not sure what the question, is there a question? Yeah, okay, you got the question.
Joanna and I were talking about kids and sport, our own kids and what we were like as kids. And I think the thing I feel really strongly about is safeguarding. I think that girls are perhaps often even more at risk, but it is something we take really seriously for all children. So I gave evidence to the White Review for British gymnastics. British gymnastics, I was a gymnast. My daughters were both gymnasts. And I saw things that I wouldn't want to happen in any sport ever again. And I think that is the most fundamental point of any performance pathway, because kids shouldn't be really thought about in terms of performance. They're kids. And they've got a lot of their life to live after sport, whether or not they make it to the elite level or not. So I think safeguarding has got to be central. And I'm really proud of what British gymnastics has done. It was painful for them. It was deeply painful for them to admit what was going on. So I feel really strongly that when we talk about performance pathways for girls, that safeguarding is the most important thing, that we are building pathways for these kids to have amazing lives outside of sport as well as inside it.
Anybody else want to pick up on?
I think the same thing is for I know that girls go through a massive change at puberty that boys go through in a very different way. And we don't have the same level of research into girls' bodies. And when we change and when our Q angle changes, and we actually sometimes find ourselves not so good at sport for a little part as we get to know our body, and having all those talks about periods, about pelvic floors, about things very kind of natural for a woman to those athletes, making sure they're fueling properly. And we're not looking at these bodies that are underfueled for competition in terms of athletics. Kind of leaner is maybe best for 6 months, but not going to give you that body as a woman that you need as an athlete. So really considering female sport and female athletes separately to the men and the boys, and making sure they have that full support going through to develop a body that is is an athlete for life and strong for life. And maybe it takes a little longer to get where they want to get, but having that patience with girls and encouragement that it will happen. It's not just a linear progress for girls as they go through school.
I can jump in there with some good news. The owner of the Washington Spirit, who also owns the London City Lionesses and owns Lyon here in France. Her name is Michelle Kang. She's starting their first ever research-specific innovation hub for female athletes. So I think the number right now is only 6% of research goes to female athletes. So she's starting an innovation hub called Kaniska, which will be the first of its kind, which will do cutting edge research on the menstrual cycle. How does a period affect an athlete? And she will be developing training practices and best practices from this research, which I think is going to be absolutely game changing. Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the things that OECD statistics looks at is physical activity by different age. And yes, there's a drop off in physical activity around puberty in females in every country, but spectacularly different rates. There are some countries which do so much better than others. And I think that's well worth bigger, deeper dive than we currently have as to why, there are some countries, and not always the countries you'd expect, where the drop off is much less than in other countries. Are there any other questions from the audience? I see one at the back there.
Thank you all so much. My name is Guðrún and I come from the Icelandic permanent delegation. I would be interested in learning a bit more about the topic from a more intersectional point of view. And I'm especially thinking about the very recently concluded Paralympic Games, of course. So if you have any reflections on how the gender pay gap and how gender inequalities in general in sport intersect with other factors, including, for instance, disabilities, race, based on what you know, and whether you have any information on what has been done to address this, or ideas on how to best draw attention to this. Thank you.
Okay, a big question. I don't know who amongst our panel would like to have a go at that, or some aspect of that. It's such a big topic.
I can maybe discuss it purely from my own experience in football, if you'll allow me. I think football is very, very bad at dealing with intersectionality. It is like the industry can only hold one thing at once. It can only deal with sexism. It cannot deal with sexism and racism at the same time. And it certainly can't sort of approach, in my experience, anything outside of that, whether that's transphobia, homophobia, whatever it may be. The industry in football, in my experience, is particularly bad at that. And I think if you go into statistics around leadership and people that reside in the really most powerful positions, if you look specifically for the presence of, for example, Black women, so the intersection of race and gender, they're just nowhere to be seen. Like literally, that is the statistic. It's that they are nowhere to be seen. So it's like we can take steps forwards in having people from different ethnic backgrounds and things like that, or we can take steps forward on sort of more gender equitable decision-making bodies, but it's very, very challenging for there to be any conversations about intersectionality. I've literally seen decision makers like recoil and shut down if you ask them to hold more than one consideration for diversity at one time. That's not a particularly uplifting reflection, but I felt really compelled to say it because I think we have to be honest about where we're not making progress. And I think anything in relation to intersectionality is a huge area where there is just a void of progress.
Yeah, that's sad to hear, but not totally surprising. I think we find that exactly that in other areas of economic life, in work, in labour markets. Unfortunately, very difficult to get that. It seems to be very difficult to take both things into account at once. Any other questions, including, I haven't checked my chat, if there's any on the chat, which I will be doing now. No, not for the moment, unless they've not come through. In which case, I'm going to go to the lightning question around at the end, because normally, of course, my job would be to try and summarize this discussion, because that's what moderators are supposed to do. I'm very jet lagged. I'm just back from, well, Rio, so don't feel too sorry for me yesterday. So I'm not going to try and do the summary. I'm going to get you to try and do the summary for me, which is really to go around you to ask what you see as the #1 priority in promoting pay equity in sports. And if you want to go a bit further, what can policymakers do? So it might be #1 priority for society, but if there's anything that you think policymakers, so governments, should be doing, that would be very useful. How should we do this? Should we do it in the same order that we started?
Sure, why not? It's the same answer, priority and policy, so it'll make it quick. 50-50 leadership. Really thrilled from Elizabeth, and we'd heard it. It was wildfire around our Women in Sport WhatsApp group earlier in the week that this is happening in Australia. A recent count of leaders in the top 20 sports in England for participation showed that for the lead roles of chair, CEO, and performance director, 17% were women. If women who understand sport had been 50% of the leaders from the get-go, sport wouldn't look like it looks now. We wouldn't be overturning bans in football, and we wouldn't be playing in white shorts. So I would vote for 50-50 leadership. I think it would tick both those boxes quite nicely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thora?
I agree. I think policy needs to come first, and then we could have Professor Berry maybe talk to every single sponsor and go over the numbers with them. That would be great if they just realize that they're thinking things wrong. Maybe it'll change.
Well, we'll cut that clip out and send it to you so that you can take it to the sponsors when you talk to them. Elizabeth, let me go to you next.
Look, I agree. I'm really looking forward to how this 50-50 by 2027 in leadership, boards and whatever is going to shift the picture. But I would say I'd also want to go with investment. So I'd want to go with policies or kind of nudges to get private sector to always invest equally in men and women in sport from the grassroots up to the elite level. And to get that, maybe what we need to do is to take the human story of the discrimination and its impact, the human harm that's happening today, to those who have the power to shift the investment decision.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much. Sarah, would you like to answer?
Firstly, totally agree with everything that's been said. Would love to wake up and be living in that world anytime soon. I also think that there needs to be a serious forensic investigation of like the structures and the systems around sport, because I obviously think the fight for equality is a very worthy one, but I think sometimes actually what would suit women athletes better and women's sport better is freedom from those structures. I think we have this tradition of, these typically male built structures for men's sport, and then we've got this process of integration of women and women's sport into them. I've been in a lot of rooms where rather than trying to fight my way and I just want my own room, I want freedom from those structures as opposed to being beholden to them. So I think there are opportunities within sport to actually say, listen, this process of integration is not working. How can we actually fight for freedom rather than just always fighting for equality?
Oh, that's super interesting. I wonder, David, are you still online?
I'm still here.
He is. You're there. Would
I'm
you,
here.
Because the reason why I'm asking you now is the one thing I really don't want to do is to go through our entirely female panel and then come back to the male at the end, because it doesn't seem quite right, does it? So if you don't mind, what's your view on this? What would be the one thing that you would like to see change?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's a really bad way to end this.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be terrible. And I agree that it would be better if we had more women making decisions. So the man is going to say that we should not listen to the men that much. There are too many men in sports who make the decisions, decide what the investment is. They decide where we're going with the money. And it is all very biased towards men's sports. And it would be very nice if we could get away from a world where women have to constantly justify investment in their sports in terms of financial statements. And meanwhile, men are throwing money at men's sports that have no future whatsoever. In America, we've had multiple minor league football leagues that have never been successful. And the minute one fails, another one starts. And you see this over and over and over again. So it'd be a lot better to have more women speaking and men speaking less. So on that note, I'll stop talking.
Perfect. Sophie.
I mean, I completely agree that the decision making and women leadership. I think the one thing I'd say is that every woman has a voice and everyone has power. And where we've seen driving great change is women just understanding what we're entitled to, and every single woman calling it out. Where you're calling out kind of some media that is like it's just showing the woman at the back. It's not showing men. It's not showing women. It's just showing men. If we're calling out all the stories are like it's 90% men, and then thinking about where we put our money, because we spend the money in the household, and we can choose to spend our money at brands that sponsor. And in my world, races are equitable to female athletes, but sponsors that go to sports that are 50-50 women. So I think every single woman can call things out. Every woman can decide where we spend our money. But we need the leadership to drive that structural change from the ground up.
Wonderful. Perfect. Joanna, finish us off.
First of all, we all need to be best friends. That's first and foremost. And second of all, I love the idea of female voices, female power, and putting your money where you want to see change. I think everyone here has brought such enlightenment and discovery to this conversation, and everyone in this audience listening on Zoom has a role to play in this growth. Go to a game, turn on your television, invest in female sports, have your young daughters play sports, and that incremental change, I think, will lead to significant impact.
And I think we are getting there in some respects. Not that long ago, I was wandering through London. London, when Arsenal is playing, North London just goes completely red. It's an amazing sight. And I was wandering through one weekend, and it was completely red. And it was the women who were playing, and it was selling out. It was completely selling out the Emirates Stadium, one of the biggest stadiums in England, 70,000 nearly people there, and it sold out for more than one game last season. I mean, it's an astonishing change that we're seeing, and it completely puts the lie, as David and everybody has been saying, it's this idea that somehow women's sports is not generating the same sort of revenue. Definitely is. Right, that has been a fabulous afternoon. I have learned so much. What we need to do is to thank our panelists. Please, not in the polite OECD way. Do it properly, guys. I've missed something incredibly important. There you go. I'm supposed to be the moderator. There is one last thing. Maybe the panelists could stay. Would you mind? Is that okay? Yeah. Well, in which case, I would really like to thank the Icelandic ambassador, Unnur, if you wouldn't mind, just to make us some final comments. Thank you very much.
Does this work? Yeah. Wow. Well, Secretary General Mathias Cormann, distinguished speakers, dear guests. This panel discussion, co-organized by the OECD and Iceland's permanent representation to the OECD, is coming to an end. This is the fourth time we have organized an Equal Pay Day event. And this year we decided to focus on sports. And I can't express how happy and grateful we are to have you all with us here today. Thank you all so much. And to share with us your experiences, your thoughts, and expertise on this topic. We learned really a lot. We know that this can be a delicate subject, especially for those most confronted with the issue at the height of their sports career. So even a stronger reason to thank you for coming. It has been a mind-blowing and essential discussion, I would say. This topic deserves more attention. And I encourage you to continue reflecting on today's debate and draw lessons from it. That is exactly what we will try to do in our representation. I will do just that also at the next meeting of the Friends of Gender Plus on October 2nd, which is co-chaired by Nadia Enser, Ambassador of Luxembourg, and David Brooke, Ambassador of Ireland to the OECD. Thank you so much for the invitation. For those unfamiliar with OECD's internal work, this Friends group has been instrumental in advancing gender equality within the organization and throughout the policy work it delivers to its members. Gender equality is also a cornerstone of Iceland's foreign and domestic policy, and we try to actively work on and promote gender equality in all our work. I see many similarities between today's and past Equal Pay Day events. However, we are substantially lagging behind in our work on equality in the sports world regarding opportunities, funding, policies, and salaries. We also need to address our own bias about women in sports, because the truth is that girls show the same interest in sports as boys. And we need to work from the grassroots level, invest more, deal with underrepresentation, and fight against discrimination and sexism. Dear guests, Let me take this opportunity to thank Secretary General Mathias Corman for his unwavering support of gender equality and for always supporting our small team in our endeavor. I would also like to wholeheartedly thank my team and the staff of ELS Directorate for your work, dedication, and passion you have put into the organization of this and past events with us. You know who you are. Finally, let me also thank the experts, world champions, and Olympic athletes who agreed to participate and contribute to today's discussion on the pay gap in sports. Thank you all very much for your attendance.